Hey, what is up? Welcome to this episode of the Entrepreneur to Entrepreneur podcast. As always, I'm your host, Brian Lofermento, and for better or for worse, we as entrepreneurs are idea factories, but having an idea is drastically different from implementing that idea. And that's why I know that all of you are absolutely going to love today's guest, because this is someone who recognizes and acknowledges the fact that there are so many ideas out there, but most importantly, she helps bring this stuff into reality. So let me introduce you to today's guest. Her name is Rebecca Shah. Rebecca has always believed that there are more good ideas out there than there are people who can execute them well. That's why she works at the intersection of strategy, people, and operations, partnering with mission-driven organizations to move from talking about their strategic plans to actually making them happen. Over the past 16 years, she's led implementation efforts inside and alongside organizations with annual revenue starting at $500,000 all the way up to state agencies that oversee billions with a B, which with more resources comes more potential power for change and impact. She founded her consulting practice in 2020 and founded the Mission Delivery Network earlier this year to build a community for organizations who are ready to scale, sustain, and inspire their teams, all traits and attributes that we need to think about in our businesses. So I'm excited about this one. I'm not going to say anything else. Let's dive straight into my interview with Rebecca Shah. All right, Rebecca, I am so very excited that you're here with us today. First things first, welcome to the show.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Heck yes, I'm excited to hear about your backstory, because not only do you do cool work here, but I know that a lot of stuff led up to you launching your own business 5 years ago. So Rebecca, let's start with you. Take us beyond the bio. Who's Rebecca? How'd you start doing all these cool things?
Yes, so I always thought I wanted to start a nonprofit. I went through undergrad, grad school, worked in nonprofits for about 8 years, and had this vision of starting a nonprofit. So I guess I was an entrepreneur from the start without really recognizing it. And during that time when I was working alongside the executive director at the nonprofit, I was watching very closely how she worked, what she did, what her job was, and realized not only did I not like a lot of it, I also didn't think I'd be very good at it. So a big part of it is fundraising and working with external communities beyond your organization. And I really loved all things internal. So while I was there, I learned a lot about myself. I joked that I got engaged and had 2 babies and moved around 3 times. So it was a big developmental phase of my professional career and my personal life. And just came out on the other side of it ready to support organizations and really focus on implementation and execution. That is what I love. That is what I'm good at. And that is really where I wanted to spend my time. So I did that work in 2 state education agencies. Didn't think government would be the place where that would really shine. But I found a great leader that brought me in Texas, and then I followed her to Tennessee and got to do this implementation work and really shift the way the education agencies thought about their work, more from outputs to outcomes. And that is some more work that I do today. So when I left those places, I decided I wanted to get back into the nonprofit world, back serving a sector that I love and really care about. And so have been doing that both in my consulting practice and now through the Mission Delivery Network. And so we really focus on serving mission-driven organizations to stabilize, scale, and sustain.
Yes, I love that overview, Rebecca, especially because listeners already know I have been part of a team that launched an entrepreneurial nonprofit earlier this year, back in Q1 of 2025. And I've seen firsthand 2 things, Rebecca. One, it's very difficult to start a nonprofit, so I'm glad that we've already crossed that barrier. But 2, the beauty of a nonprofit, it's right there in the name, is that we're not driven by profit. And so I think that allows us so much room to dream, to just imagine making the world a better place in all the different ways that we want to do that. So our Notion board is full of, yes, ideas, which is obviously called out literally in your bio, but ideas are worthless until you bring them to life. Talk to us about that gap between ideas and execution. From your vantage point, why does that gap exist, and how the heck do we start to bridge that gap?
So the 2 roles I like to talk about in an organization that are talked a lot about in the entrepreneurial operating system are the visionary and the integrator. So most organizations, most nonprofits, organizations of any type almost always have the visionary. That's the person who dreamed up the idea in the first place, right? They were like, oh, that's a great idea. We should do this. So they start an organization or they lead an organization that then they take it in that direction. So the visionary is the one who really has those big ideas, sees the opportunities, sees around corners, knows what's coming, and is always generating new and new and new and new. The problem is, if you're always generating as your team gets bigger and or you're working in a more complex environment, or there's a lot of reasons, I can name them, you need someone who can focus on the internal to make your ideas real. So the execution side, the integrator is what we call them, keeps your team aligned, keeps accountability, connects the dots, build systems and processes and structures so that you can execute on your vision. Because we all know prioritization is important, but actually doing it is hard. And sticking to your priorities, and certainly the bigger your organization grows, and the more you have to keep people aligned internally, the harder that becomes.
Yeah, and obviously bringing up prioritization, one step up above the ideation is those strategic plans. It's funny, until I entered the world of nonprofits, I didn't realize how much strategic plans were a thing in the nonprofit world. And Rebecca, truth be told, it makes me wonder why we don't talk about strategic plans that much in the for-profit world, because having a plan is the formal step on the road to execution. Talk to us about that concept, because it's second nature to you. It's so near and dear to your heart, having been in the nonprofit world. What is that strategic plan? What's it look like? What goes into it? Because I think nonprofit or for-profit, we should all be integrating this into the way we operate.
Yes. So I love a strategic plan, but I don't love how most organizations do strategic planning. So a strategic plan on whole is how you set your big vision, you see what's in the future, you motivate your team and the organization and others in your community about what you're seeking to achieve in nonprofit world, what you want to be different for your community, how you want to be helpful, setting your mission, your vision, your values, your goals, kind of the big picture ideas for what you want to be true. Usually, it used to be 3 to 5 years. Everyone's shrinking the timeline a bit in these times. And I will say, most of them stop there. So they spend a lot of time, energy, money getting to this plan. They've engaged a ton of stakeholders, both in and out of their organization. They have a plan, and they don't change anything operationally or internally. So the team doesn't know what to do or how to do things differently in service of that plan. So the execution side says, that's great, you need these things, but you can't stop there. And ideally, you're asking the right questions along the way, so you're building out your plan that you can then implement in a real world scenario. So it's great to have big ideas, it's great to dream big, and we live in the real world. So we also have to take incremental steps towards that beautiful future that we see. So the execution side is where I see organizations go awry. They either don't build it into their plan in the first place, or they don't take the next step to say, all right, here's our underlying operating model that's made up of our structure, our processes, our personnel, and our culture. How does that need to stay the same? How does it need to be different? What needs to change internally at our organization to make this strategic plan real?
Rebecca, it makes me think of that concept. I've always loved it of we overestimate what we can do in a month, but we underestimate what we can do in a year. And you can choose any sort of timeline there. And of course, that rings true. We overestimate what we can do in a day. We underestimate what we could do in a week. And with that in mind, how do we use the word realistic, which I typically have a problem with, Rebecca, but I know it's come from you seeing so many people not execute on those big ideas that they have. How do we put together what you call a realistic plan and timeline?
This is why I love the relationship between the visionary and the integrator, right? Because if you're only focused on reality, you're never pushing, you're never moving beyond, you're never getting past, quote, that realistic version of what is now. But with the visionary doing all that dreaming up and the integrator together, that's when you're really making progress. So there's nothing stopping and nothing that should stop the visionary from looking forward and dreaming beyond reality, right? And the integrator is the one that then brings it back. It's like, that's great. And we are all human. We can only get so much done in a day, in a week, in a month, to your point. And we need to make plans internally to be sure we're all aligned. And I will say this gets more important the more complex your organization is. So when you're one person, this is probably less relevant. As you hit 10 plus employees, around 4 million plus in revenue, if you have a lot of bottlenecks at the executive level, if you are having a lot of trouble really figuring out if you have the leadership capacity, there's a few ways you can think about, is your organization in the right place where this makes sense, where you really need to focus more on reality? But there's certainly a place for organizations where you're just going to stall out, get stuck, and or burn out your team if you don't also have that layer on top that the integrator can provide.
Yeah, I really want to go there with you while we're here on the air together, because you love the internal stuff. It's something that you don't shy away from, whereas a lot of us are just like, I wish I could snap my hands and have the right team doing the right work and everybody was magically productive. Of course, it's very intentional and strategic to get to that point. So much of what I saw about your work before you and I got together today is that you really emphasize how important it is that every team member understands the purpose. They have clarity in what it is that they're supposed to be doing and why they're going to be doing it. How does all that stuff tie in together? Because it's humans we're talking about. We are the most complex creatures, and we're trying to get everybody moving in that same direction. What do those internal processes and mechanisms and strategies look like?
So certainly the piece I love most about my work is it is all about people. So anytime you're talking about organizational change, you're talking about changing people's behavior. People that work inside your organization, potentially people that work outside your organization. Like we are all humans, and we are all here, and we all have certain perspectives and ways of working that, depending on what we want moving forward, may need to shift. So that is the overlying piece that I personally find super interesting and is also really important for leaders to understand. I will say there's a few key ways that you'll know that you are ready. So the first is back to that strategic plan, having directional clarity. Your integrator is not going to be successful. Your execution is going to be super hard if you don't know where you're headed. So that's that big picture piece. The second is a visionary, so an executive director, a CEO that is willing to share control, which sounds lovely and people say they want, and then you get in there and you make them do things differently, or you suggest things that might be different from what they have done in the past, and it's really hard to change, especially when you're the founder and when that organization is near and dear to potentially your own identity, but certainly things that you care about. So having that willingness to share control is huge. The third is a clearly defined role for the integrator that is well communicated and has clear decision-making authority, because the role can get very complicated and confusing because it is not a job title and it is not a typical space that a lot of people are used to living in and working around and through. And then the fourth, I think, is pretty critical and often gets lost, and that is an organizational culture that values coordination. So if you're in a space and you're not willing to move towards coordination and collaboration, then it's going to be very hard to bring someone into the integrator role and for them to be successful.
Rebecca, it's so cool hearing you talk about all these different roles, because you're right. Some of them are super tangible that we can all relate to. We all know what a C-suite looks like. We all know what managers look like, but you're also talking about functions within a machine. And I think that that's something that's less tangible for us. Honestly, it makes me, we all see the world through our own lenses and experiences. It makes me really think of soccer tactics and formations. And what I think is so brilliant about the best teams in history is that every team has that one best player that just makes magic happen. They can score a goal out of nowhere. And I've seen firsthand in my entire life of being a soccer fan that what really supports those geniuses, Rebecca, is having the others reliably and predictably fulfill their roles. And the rigidity and the structure of those roles allows maybe a lack of rigidity and that fluidity in the genius so that the genius can survive and thrive, not just survive. It's these kind of intangible things that we all need to face in our own businesses of how much structure do I want to put on place, but how also do I not want to box genius in? I want genius to have the room to play, to have the room to come to life. Obviously, it's a bit of a philosophical question, Rebecca, but I'd love to hear from your vantage point. What do these structures and job functions look like? We all know about vertical hierarchies and maps of roles and horizontal, flatter structures. How the heck, from your perspective, should we be laying these functions and jobs out?
Well, per usual, there's no one way and there's no easy answer. You're making me laugh because we're rewatching Ted Lasso and we just watched the episode on Total Football. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. where essentially they've kind of redefined how this team is going to work together. So soccer typically works in a traditional way, and in this one episode or series of episodes, they've shifted their whole strategy, and it's required a very different way of the team working together. And in the total football way, it requires team members to be more flexible. So it doesn't have to be about rigidity. It's more about clearly defined expectations, a clear outcome the team is seeking to achieve, and people knowing their role in getting there. And that might change over time. It might change for the next 3 months, your role is this, and then in the next 6 months, your role is that. It doesn't mean it has to only be one thing and you only fit in one box, right? Because I would argue in most organizations, there's multiple geniuses, and the real value is in the collective genius of the group. So what you want to do is create a space that you've both defined what success looks like and empowered people to be successful.
Rebecca, never did I think that analogy would land the way that it did with you, but shout out to Ted Lasso for so accurately portraying total football, which was coined by the Dutch back in the 1970s. And you're right, that system really says, hey, Brian, if your position is in attack and Rebecca's in defense, sometimes if you fall the ball back and Rebecca's going to fill in for you looking forward. And it is that flexibility while also having a structure of flexibility, which sounds like something that's opposite, but really the fact that the two work hand in hand, it's such a cool thing to cultivate. And I feel like that's a natural segue right into what you're doing with the Mission Delivery Network, because I think it's so cool that you've seen so many different ways to serve the organizations that you care about and that you serve. Consulting is obviously one of those umbrellas through which you serve them, but introduce listeners to your Mission Delivery Network, because I think it's such a cool structure that you've built in order to support these clients of yours.
Yes, so the network is really designed around this idea that both, one, the integrator role is important and is intentionally designed to work behind the scenes. So it's not something that a lot of people know about, and it is not an integrator's typical personality trait to put themselves out there. So it is a role that is more quiet and more internal, and so I wanted to lift up both the importance of the role and also awesome people who are in that role and doing great work for organizations and for their communities. And then the second was because of the nature of their role. So most holistically, you can typically think about it as the leader's number two. It's very isolating. And I've seen a lot of communities pop up over the years for CEOs and leaders and executive directors, but I've seen a lot fewer, and none specifically in the nonprofit space, for integrators. One, it's not as common of a role, which I am trying to change, but also it's just something that, because it's not built around a title structure necessarily, it's hard to find who fits into that space. And someone might be playing that role in an organization, for example, that doesn't even know it because it's never been defined and it's never been something that they've really put, quote, a label on. And so I wanted to start the Mission Delivery Network for those two main reasons, and to really strengthen organizations in service of and through that position of the integrator.
Yeah, talk to us more about the structure of that, because it's fun thinking about how different these roles and functions are. I keep coming back to function. I feel like that's a way more appropriate label that we can put on it, because you've already called out a few times that there isn't a traditional just job title we can slap onto this. It really is a function that we need in that. So inside the Mission Delivery Network, what does that look like? I love the fact that there's a community element to it.
Yes, so right now, the way you join the network, your organization commits to a 12-month engagement that your integrator joins. You participate in monthly cohort sessions, monthly one-on-one calls with me. We have a Slack community that you can ask real-time questions and get feedback, and just to continue that relationship between sessions. I serve as essentially an accountability partner, which often is the integrator's role for their visionary, so they often don't have someone who plays that role for them. And just really building this community space, one cohort at a time at this point, to help integrators connect with each other. Most likely, you're going to be in that type of role in the future, including in your current organization. So for them to be able to stay connected as they continue through the work is super important for me. And I think something I would have loved when I was in integrator roles in the past. And I just wanted to create this community, really, of both organizations that have said, this is important to us, we have an integrator, we want them to be supported and connected so that they can do their job better in service of us as an organization operating more effectively and efficiently, and for the integrators themselves to have that community space to both learn from me, learn from other experts we bring in, and learn from each other.
Yeah, I love the way that you've built that. And I want to pull out two words right there in what you overlaid for us. And those two words are accountability and support. Because, Rebecca, a lot of entrepreneurs, especially a lot of executives in so many different roles, and you obviously talk about the integrators, we've never had accountability in different ways. When we are just in traditional 9-to-5 jobs, we've got built-in accountability from our bosses if we want to keep those jobs. But when it comes to making forward progress, when it comes to the stuff we're talking about today, executing on ideas, accountability is something that we're lacking and maybe that we shy away from because it feels like rigidity. It feels like traditional structure. Whereas the older I get, the more mature I get in my entrepreneurial journey, the more I realize, no, true accountability is support. What does accountability look like in your world? Because I think that that's something that enhances all of our abilities to execute on our ideas.
So I don't think you even did this on purpose, but you're teeing me up perfectly to talk about this framework that kind of is the underpinning to the network itself. And it came, honestly, from listening to a parenting podcast. So I listen to a lot of podcasts. I also have 2 kids across parenting, psychology, entrepreneurship, etc., education. I worked in education for many years before what I do now. And one of the ideas across both education and parenting is this concept of high execution or high expectations and high support. So on the one side, you have high expectations. That's typically the role of the visionary to define what success looks like, provide direction, provide that clarity, focus in on what the future is and what the quality expectations are to that point. And then you have high support. And that's where the integrator lives, typically. Of course, these things are not as rigid as I know they feel, because I know a lot of visionaries back away from rigidity. So it's to create that structure so that when you're working outside of it, you can name it and explain and be clear on what the shift in expectation is. But that high support side really is about empowering people to be successful through this building of capacity, systems, and alignment internally.
Rebecca, hearing you talk about all these things, it makes me want to sit down and take action. I will confess this to you while we're on the air together. I'm very excited to sit down and start putting it into practice, which makes me want to ask you while we're together, what does this practice look like? Is it something that we as founders of our businesses, whether we're visionary or we're bringing in an integrator to sit alongside us in these functions, is it something that once a week we should be sitting down and asking these super intentional and strategic questions? Is it built-in natural checkpoints? Is it milestones that we should be setting out? What does it look like to put it into practice in our businesses?
So there's the baseline of what I will call the operating rhythm, which is your personal cadence throughout the year of how you review strategy and operations within your business. So on whole, annually, I think most people are used to having some sort of like annual review of strategy, and especially if you lead an organization, usually you bring your team together in person to talk about strategy. The problem is most of the time, that happens once a year. So in this operating rhythm, the idea is that you have this annual strategy review. It doesn't need to be a big strategic plan. It doesn't need to be some huge process that takes a ton of time and energy, but it does need to be intentional to kind of ask yourself some big questions around what worked, what didn't last year. That requires you to know what you were trying to do last year, hence the annual process, to reset your goals and priorities for the upcoming year. And I will say I do this in my own business. So first step is, what do I want to accomplish at the end of the next year? I do it on a calendar year. It doesn't matter. Pick a time frame and make it work for you. The second piece then is quarterly. Okay, if by the end of the year I want to be here, what do I need to do each quarter to get there? And these are high-level, big picture things. For me, they span across the functions as we were talking about. So visionary, integrator, sales and marketing, finance, and then of course all my project delivery work, both on the consulting side and the mission delivery network side. So those are the categories I think within. Then monthly, okay, every month I take a look at the month ahead. What are my personal commitments? What are my work commitments? What else do I need to be focused on this month in addition to my professional space? And how am I going to map out what I want to get done? Then I take that monthly and every week on Fridays, I look at that to plan my next week. So I think, okay, if at the end of the month, XYZ needs to be true, what do I need to prioritize next week? Of course, there's a ton of other things I do in a week, but what are my most important big priorities? And then at the end of every day, I look to my next day and shuffle as I need to make sure that I'm hitting towards those quarterly and yearly. And then I have a longer term kind of 3 or 10-year vision milestones. Because when you come back every quarter to say, am I on track? Am I making progress? You have to know what you're trying to make progress towards.
Rebecca, I love how you lay that out for us. It is so strategic and so intentional. And that's the more that I looked into your work, intentional is the one word that I just keep coming back to. I'm going to totally put you on the spot here for the sake of listeners and myself, Rebecca, because anytime we tune into podcasts, it's always kind of the ideal state. It gets us really excited about implementing these things. But the reality is that oftentimes we get derailed. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you, what are some of those things that can derail us along the way? I'm sure you've seen it in so many different places, whether it's derailed because it goes over timeline, we underestimated how long it's going to take, or other things have bumped up the priority order. What are some of those derailings and how can we avoid them?
The biggest one is adding priorities without intentionality and without I will say accepting reality that you can't just keep adding priorities and expect more and more to get done if you're not also adding more people or time or resources in some way, right? If your team is accomplishing X with the current resources, there's no reason to think that they're going to be able to accomplish the whole alphabet with the same number of resources. So I will say the biggest one I see, and especially for visionaries that don't have an integrator counterbalance, and even when they do, if they are not willing to listen and or heed the advice of their integrator counterpoint, then there just become too many priorities. Because everyone on your team is making choices, including yourself, in how to spend your time every day, whether you're doing it on purpose or because 3 different people slacked you something they need from you, even if that's not your highest, most important thing for the day. So everyone on your team is making those choices every day. And if you're not guiding that, they don't have direction, so they're having to guide it themselves. So I will say that is probably the biggest one I see. And then the second is just someone to hold you accountable. So for myself, I am an integrator by nature. Holding myself accountable is relatively second nature for me, and it's still hard. Sometimes I put it on my calendar every week, every quarter, and every year as a reminder for myself, oh, I need to block out the time today to spend my brain energy thinking about my business and my priorities and where I want to be in the future. I was just texting with another consulting friend this morning to try to get a collective kind of annual retreat going, because what I am not as good at is the visionary work. So how can I bring in someone to help me be accountable to keeping that forward vision going, that 5-10 year vision? So accountability is probably the other big one.
Yes, I love that. Ooh, you just put all of us on blast for all the different things that derail us along the way. It's that one question, you said it right there, and it's probably been the biggest lesson that I've picked up over the past 2 years. Part of it is through the luxury of being able to grow my teams across my business portfolios. But that question that you raised that I've been asking myself is anytime I add a priority, it's mapped not only with a date and an urgency, but most importantly, who the heck's going to do this? Because Rebecca, historically, I tricked myself into believing I can do this and I can do this and I can do this. The reality is, if it's on my plate, chances are it's not going to be done. And I've just gotten old enough to accept the fact that that's a truth. So I'm very careful and steadfast about who it is that's going to take it. So Rebecca, at the end of every single episode, I love asking this super broad question. You've dropped so many nuggets of knowledge on us, and you've called us out in all the best ways during our conversation today. But the final question that I always ask is, what's your best piece of advice for listeners? Knowing that we're being listened to by both entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs at all different stages of their own growth journeys, and also knowing that you're one of us, you're a fellow entrepreneur that's in the trenches facing all of these real world things. What's that one piece of advice that you want to leave them with today?
Well, perhaps not surprisingly, my biggest piece of advice, especially for entrepreneurs, is to know if you're a visionary by nature or an integrator. So you can probably do both things. You are probably skilled in adapting to your environment and what's important, and you are almost certainly naturally better and like more one than the other. So there's a lot of ways to figure that out. There's a book called Rocket Fuel that gives a lot of great information about this. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I also post a lot about this. There's a lot of great information, obviously, through the network that we talk about what are you and what are your strengths, what are your weaknesses. But I think figuring that out will save you a lot of struggle as you continue to grow and scale your organizations.
Yes, that advice is so important. Oftentimes, awareness, especially self-awareness, is that first step in us making those optimizations and improvements. And Rebecca, you're making my life easy as a host today because you've already alluded to following you on LinkedIn. So at this point in time, I'm so excited for listeners to go deeper into all the great things that you're putting out there in the world. I love your messaging. It really is an inspiring message that makes me want to work and make me want to work not only more, but also strategically and intentionally. So drop those links on us. Where should listeners go from here?
Perfect. So you can find me personally, Rebecca Shah, on LinkedIn. You can also find the Mission Delivery Network there. And then you can learn more at www.missiondeliverynetwork.com.
Yes, and listeners, you already know the drill. We're making it as easy as possible for you to find those links down below in the show notes, no matter where it is that you're tuning into today's episode. If you're on the go, if you're driving, don't worry about remembering those links or writing them down. You can click right on through from the show notes down below. So, Rebecca, on behalf of myself and all the listeners worldwide, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
It's been fun. Thank you.